Welcome back to my channel, John Bean Story. Today, I have the story, Shadow at Evervale Hall. The fog curled along the countryside like ghostly fingers reaching across the moor. On the narrow road to Evervale Hall, a black motorcar hummed steadily through the mist. Inside, Professor Jonathan Elmridge adjusted his spectacles as he reread the invitation once more. You are cordially invited to Evervale Hall for the 70th birthday of Lord Alistair Hollingworth. Your presence would honor us. Jonathan, a retired historian with a passion for unsolved crimes, wasn't sure why he had been invited. Lord Hollingworth had been a patron of the university, but their acquaintance was distant. Perhaps it was fate. He welcomed the distraction. As the car climbed the final slope, the silhouette of Evervale Hall loomed out of the fog, a grand, ivy-draped estate that stood defiant against time and weather. Its windows glowed faintly like watchful eyes. Inside, preparations were underway. Servants bustled with silver trays and floral arrangements. Family members gathered in the drawing room, each with their own secrets, smiles, and silent rivalries. And in the darkened corners, the house seemed to whisper, "Something is coming." Chapter 1. Arrival at Evervale. Professor Jonathan Elmridge stepped out of the car and was greeted by the butler, Mr. Latham, a stately man with silver hair and a voice like velvet. He was ushered into the grand foyer of Evervale Hall, where portraits of stoic ancestors loomed down from high-paneled walls. The drawing room was warm, scented faintly with cedarwood and old books. The family had gathered casually before the formal dinner. Lord Alistair Hollingworth, though aged, retained an imposing presence, tall, lean, his gaze still sharp despite the cane at his side. He greeted Jonathan with the politeness of a host, but the detachment of a monarch. "Professor Elmridge, a pleasure." "We're honored by your presence," Lord Alistair said. "The pleasure is mine," Jonathan replied. "Evervale is even more magnificent than I remembered." Introductions followed swiftly. Edgar, the eldest son, stern, business-minded, with eyes that never smiled. Beatrice, Alistair's daughter, elegant, veiled and melancholy. Miles, the youngest, affable but distracted, accompanied by his boisterous American wife, Vivian. Mrs. Weatherby, the widowed sister-in-law, who seemed to take quiet joy in observing everyone with cat-like intensity. And the staff, Mr. Latham, the discreet butler, Miss Tilly, the nervous maid, and cook, who had apparently ruled the kitchen for decades. Conversation flowed lightly, but Jonathan's historian instincts picked up undercurrents. Edgar and Beatrice exchanged looks that hinted at unfinished arguments. Vivian's laugh was a little too loud. Lord Alistair, though smiling, seemed distant, as though waiting for something or someone. During a walk in the conservatory before dinner, Jonathan overheard hushed voices behind a rose-laced trellis. "He doesn't deserve any of it," one voice hissed. "Lower your voice. Not here. Not now," came the reply. He didn't recognize the speakers, but he made a mental note. Back inside, the grandfather clock struck 6. A servant rang the bell for dinner, and the family began to move toward the dining hall. The birthday celebration was about to begin, but Jonathan already sensed this was a house on edge. Something had happened, or was about to, and he was now in the middle of it. Chapter 2. A Toast to Secrets. The dining hall at Evervale Hall was a place carved from history. Dark wood paneling, a vaulted ceiling, and a fireplace large enough to stand in. Candlelight danced across silverware as the family gathered at the long oak table, dressed in their best evening attire. Lord Alistair sat at the head of the table, his glass raised high. 70 years, he began, his voice both solemn and proud. 70 years, and still I find myself surprised by the twists of life and family. To all of you, I offer my thanks. The guests raised their glasses, murmuring a chorus of "To Alistair!" and "Happy Birthday!" But not all toasts were sincere. Jonathan, seated midway down the table, noted the stiff posture of Edgar, the tight smile of Beatrice, and the way Vivian sipped her wine before the toast was even complete. Dinner proceeded with roasted game hen and red wine. The mood remained civil until Lord Alistair, perhaps emboldened by the wine, tapped his glass again and addressed the room. "It is a night of celebration, and perhaps a night for confessions. There have been decisions made regarding the future of Evervale, decisions some of you may not like." An uncomfortable silence fell. Edgar's fork clinked too loudly against his plate. Beatrice avoided her father's gaze. Miles looked up with surprise, while Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Father, Edgar said carefully. "Perhaps this is a discussion for another time." "Nonsense," Lord Alistair replied. "We are family, and families should not fear the truth." Jonathan watched the scene unfold with growing tension. He was no stranger to family drama, but this had the flavor of long-held resentment. Then came the comment that chilled the air. "If Evervale falls into the wrong hands," Beatrice said softly, but clearly, "it won't be standing by your next birthday." Gasps and nervous laughter rippled through the room. Lord Alistair's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat, Beatrice?" "Merely an observation." She stood and excused herself, leaving the hall in silence broken only by the crackling fire. Jonathan's mind raced. He'd only been at Evervale for a day, and already secrets were beginning to stir beneath the surface. He glanced around the table, measuring reactions. Edgar was brooding. Vivian seemed amused. Miles stared down at his untouched dessert. Lord Alistair cleared his throat. "Well then, let us not let sharp words dull the evening." There was brandy in the drawing room. As the family rose and began to drift into smaller groups, Jonathan lingered behind. The mood had changed. A storm was coming. He could feel it, and it would strike before morning. Chapter 3. A Locked Room. Morning came cloaked in drizzle, the fog reluctant to release its grip on the estate. A maid's scream shattered the fragile calm. Professor Jonathan Elmridge had barely finished dressing when Miss Tilly burst into the corridor, pale as parchment, clutching her apron. "It's Master Edgar, sir. The study. He won't wake." Jonathan followed the commotion down the hall, his mind already calculating. The household gathered near the heavy oak door of Lord Alistair's private study, now Edgar's, after his father ceded much of the estate's paperwork to him. Mr. Latham the butler stood with a key, hesitant. Lord Alistair gave a curt nod. The lock turned with a groan. Inside, Edgar Hollingworth sat slumped in the high-backed leather chair behind the desk. His eyes stared vacantly ahead. A half-filled glass of brandy rested in his hand. The fire had died out, and the room was cold. Dr. Whitley, the local physician, was summoned quickly and pronounced Edgar dead. "Sometime late last night," he concluded. "No sign of violence. It could be poison or heart failure. We'll need the coroner." Jonathan noticed details others overlooked. The window was latched from the inside. The single door was locked. No broken glass, no note. Vivian let out a dramatic gasp. "You mean he was murdered? Here? Alone?" "Let's not jump to conclusions," Dr. Whitley warned. The police arrived an hour later from the nearby town of Bridgeham. Inspector Charles Linton, a methodical man with a dry manner, questioned everyone briefly and ordered the room sealed. Jonathan lingered nearby, his gaze sweeping the room once more before the door closed. The hearth was swept clean, but a faint char mark on the stone caught his eye. He said nothing. Later in the drawing room, Lord Alistair stood like a stone monument, his face unreadable. "My son, gone, in this house, on my birthday." Beatrice sat silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Miles paced, running fingers through his hair. "Was anyone with Edgar last night after dinner?" Inspector Linton asked. No one spoke. "Did he retire early?" Linton pressed. Mr. Latham answered. "He took brandy into the study around 10 o'clock, said he needed quiet." Jonathan observed their faces as the inspector questioned them. There were no outbursts, no clear lies, but there was fear. Someone in the room knew more than they were saying. After the police finished their round of questioning, Jonathan stepped outside into the misty garden paths. His mind churned. A man dies in a locked room. No blood, no weapon, no clear cause. He whispered aloud, "No escape, no entry, unless someone never left." The mystery had begun. Chapter 4. Web of Motives. The day wore on beneath a sky the color of slate. Evervale Hall felt subdued, its hallways muffled by more than just the heavy carpets. Grief and suspicion hung in the air. Inspector Linton began formal interviews, setting up in the small morning room while Mr. Latham kept tea and silence circulating. Jonathan was permitted to sit in as a neutral observer. It was a clever guise, for it allowed him to watch faces and ask the sort of gentle, thoughtful questions no officer could pose without raising defensiveness. The interrogations revealed cracks beneath the Hollingworth family veneer. Beatrice, soft-spoken but steely, admitted that Edgar had threatened to cut her out of the will entirely if she refused to sell her shares in the family company. "He said I was sentimental. That sentiment had no place in business, but Evervale is more than a ledger. It's our home." Miles, younger and less certain, confessed that Edgar had belittled him for years. Said I was a dreamer. Said I'd run the family name into the ground. But it was Vivian he hated, really. She never played by his rules. Vivian, for her part, seemed almost amused. Edgar loathed me, and the feeling was mutual. He thought I was a gold digger. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't the gold I came for. Mrs. Weatherby, the widowed sister-in-law, revealed the deepest secret yet. Alistair once promised Edgar everything, but I knew he had second thoughts. A man of his age doesn't speak of legacy without a plan. And Lord Alistair himself? He said little, only that Edgar had become a stranger. He was not the son I raised. He became cold, unyielding. Staff interviews added their own shading. Miss Tilly recalled hearing voices in the study around midnight, but was too frightened to check. Mr. Latham revealed Edgar had ordered him to fetch an old set of keys from the butler's drawer the day before he died. No alibi was perfect, no motive conclusive, but to Jonathan it was as though every room whispered the same thing. They all had reason, they all had something to lose, and they all had something to hide. Chapter 5. A Clue in the Ashes. Rain tapped softly on the windows as Jonathan returned to the study. Inspector Linton had given temporary access to him, more out of courtesy than trust. The room still felt cold, though the fire had since been rekindled. Jonathan knelt by the hearth, eyes scanning the sooty base. It was subtle, a small corner of parchment barely intact, tucked beneath the iron grate. Using tweezers from his travel case, he lifted it carefully. The edges were blackened, but enough remained to read a few damning words. "You don't deserve Evervale. I will see to it you never." The handwriting was aggressive, scrawled hastily. It was unsigned. Jonathan's heart quickened. Was it a threat made in anger, or a promise fulfilled? Before he could analyze further, Miss Tilly entered with tea. Her hands trembled. "Miss Tilly," he said gently, "were you the one who heard voices outside the study that night?" She nodded. "Around midnight, someone whispered something. Sharp. I couldn't make it out. I thought it might be a dream. But then I saw a shadow. Someone slipped into the hall. They were quick. I only saw a shape." "Could it have been one of the family?" She hesitated. "Too tall to be Mrs. Weatherby. Too slender to be Lord Alistair. That's all I can say." Jonathan thanked her and sat alone for a time, staring at the fireplace. One scrap of paper, one frightened maid, one locked room. None of it yet added up, and yet the pieces were beginning to form an outline. Jonathan sketched in his notebook. He circled the phrase from the note. He wrote beside it, "Who stands to lose Evervale? Who acts from desperation, not hate?" A motive was beginning to emerge. But he knew from experience, motives meant little without opportunity, and in this house, time and space obeyed their own rules. Somewhere, a door had opened that should not have, and someone had stepped through it with murder in their heart. Chapter 6. Shadows and Alibis. Jonathan spent the next morning quietly reviewing the statements collected so far. He wasn't a policeman, but decades of teaching history had trained his mind to spot discrepancies, and history, he liked to say, was made of lies finally exposed. He began with Miles. "I went to bed shortly after 11, the young man said, his fingers tapping a cigarette case nervously. Vivian was already asleep. I didn't hear a thing, but Vivian, spoken to separately, claimed otherwise. I waited up for him. We argued, about money of course. He left the room in a huff, said he needed a walk, didn't come back until well past midnight. So which was it? Then came Beatrice. She was serene, almost too much so. I read for an hour, then took a sleeping draught. I heard nothing. Miss Tilly, however, had seen a soft light under Beatrice's door until at least 1 in the morning. She was awake, the maid insisted, and pacing. I heard her footsteps through the floorboards. Jonathan noted it down. When questioned again, Lord Alistair was terse. "I'm an old man. I sleep lightly but remember little. I heard footsteps once. I thought perhaps it was Edgar himself. And Mrs. Weatherby?" Her smile was knowing. "I keep odd hours. I was in the east sitting room reading. Alone, I'm afraid. But I heard someone come down the stairs just before the clock struck 1. Whoever it was, they moved like they didn't want to be heard. Alibis fell apart under scrutiny. Not one account matched fully. Someone was lying. Possibly more than one." Jonathan walked the hall after tea, pausing at every door, measuring distances, sightlines. A mirror in the corridor caught reflections from 3 rooms. A creaky board lay outside the study. He was beginning to form a map. Not of the house, but of silence, of avoidance. At dinner, conversation was sparse. Vivian played with her wineglass. Beatrice barely spoke. Miles had shadows under his eyes. The mood was brittle. Jonathan knew this house was full of shadows, and behind them someone waited, hoping no one looked closely enough to see the truth. Chapter 7. Another Body. The morning air was heavy with the scent of damp earth as a low fog lingered over Evervale's garden paths. Just after dawn, it was Cook who stumbled across the second tragedy. She had gone to collect herbs from the old greenhouse, a place long neglected, its glass panes mottled with grime. There, lying beside a collapsed shelf of terracotta pots, was the lifeless body of Miss Tilly. Jonathan arrived moments after the scream. The scene was far more brutal than Edgar's quiet death. Blood pooled beneath her head, and a nearby gardening tool, a rusted trowel, was darkened with gore. Inspector Linton moved quickly. Blunt force trauma to the skull, likely struck from behind, no signs of robbery. Jonathan knelt beside the body, his expression grim. She was scared. She knew something. Whispers turned to open panic inside the house. Mrs. Weatherby clutched her shawl. Vivian wept, real tears this time. Miles looked ashen, his hands shaking. Beatrice sat frozen, lips parted in shock. This was no coincidence, Lord Alistair said coldly. Someone is erasing the evidence. Jonathan quietly agreed. Tilly had seen a figure the night Edgar died. Now she was silenced. A search of Tilly's small room revealed nothing out of place, except a torn scrap of paper tucked into a Bible. It matched the burned letter Jonathan had found. He examined it under the lamplight. A partial phrase remained, "We'll see it fall to ruin before I let you." Together, both scraps hinted at a furious warning. But whose handwriting was it? Jonathan reviewed his notes. 2 deaths. 1 locked room mystery. 1 message, partially destroyed, and now a maid, killed for knowing too much. "The killer's getting desperate," he murmured to Linton, "or reckless, possibly both." Outside, the fog began to lift, but inside Evervale the shadows deepened. The game had turned deadly, and Jonathan knew. The answers lay in the paths not taken, and the secrets buried beneath this house's foundation. Chapter 8. The Secret Passage. The rain had stopped by afternoon, but the air inside Evervale felt even heavier. Jonathan wandered the halls alone, tracing and retracing his steps from the night of Edgar's death. "I leave everything in order. E.H." "Too tidy," Jonathan murmured. He turned the page over, holding it to the light. The signature, E.H., was deliberate, but the pressure of the pen was inconsistent with other samples of Edgar's handwriting he had reviewed in personal letters. Jonathan retrieved one such letter from his briefcase, dated a year earlier. He compared the loops, the slope, the angle. "This was forged," he said decisively, "and badly. Whoever did it was in a hurry. Or never thought it would be questioned." Linton nodded. "I had my doubts too, but it gets worse." He pulled out a document with the estate's seal, Edgar's will. Or rather, a codicil, a change made to the will just 4 days before his death. "This document," Linton said, "reallocates a portion of Edgar's shares to a single beneficiary, not Beatrice, not Miles, not even his father." Jonathan scanned the name, Vivian Hollingworth. He let out a breath. "That's bold. And potentially lethal," Linton replied. Vivian, who had every reason to be excluded, suddenly stood to gain more than any other member of the family. "If Edgar had truly written this note," Jonathan said, holding it up, "why hide it? Why leave no copy with the lawyer? And why alter the will just before taking his life?" The answer, of course, was simple. He hadn't. Jonathan placed both documents side by side. This was an elaborate staging. First, the locked room, then the note. The killer knew someone like Edgar might inspire suspicion, so they painted a picture, a man in despair, haunted by failure. Linton leaned back, and that picture just fell apart. The noose was tightening, a motive had crystallized. Now all that remained was to uncover the last link, the hand that held the pen, and the shadow behind the mask. Chapter 10. The Gathering Storm. That evening, Jonathan sent quiet invitations to every remaining member of the household. A supper was to be held at 8 o'clock in the main dining hall, in honor of Edgar, he said, but also in the name of truth. By the time the family gathered, tension hung like a storm cloud overhead. No one spoke as they took their seats. The table, once vibrant with candles and wine, now felt like a tribunal. Even the servants were dismissed. Jonathan remained standing, a single folder tucked under his arm. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "You may wonder why I've asked for this gathering. We've lost 2 lives, Edgar and Miss Tilly. Something didn't fit. The locked room, the whispers in the dark, the missing time." He paused outside the study and ran his fingers along the wainscoting. The paneling was old, hand-carved. In one corner, just beneath a faded wall sconce, the wood had a faint groove, out of place and slightly raised. He pressed it. With a low click, a section of the panel swung inward. Beyond it lay darkness, a narrow passage, just wide enough for a person to walk through sideways, stretched into the heart of the manor. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of dust and long-sealed secrets. Jonathan lit a candle and stepped inside. The walls were rough stone, and the floor dipped slightly, suggesting it ran beneath the main hallway. After several turns, the passage opened behind a bookcase, in the morning room. Another push, and the back of the shelf tilted slightly. From the outside, it would have been impossible to detect. Jonathan's mind raced. This was how it had been done. The killer had entered the study from this hidden corridor, bypassing locked doors and latched windows. Returning to the study, he examined the fireplace again. A faint drag mark near the hearthstone suggested something had been moved, or someone had stood there for a long time. He traced the route from study to morning room to garden. The secret passage allowed access across the house without ever being seen. Now he understood. The killer hadn't needed a key. They'd needed knowledge of Evervale's bones, its past, its forgotten architecture. And someone had that knowledge. Later that evening, Jonathan sat with Inspector Linton and shared his findings. "So it wasn't locked to the killer, only to us," Linton said, stunned. Jonathan nodded. "And Miss Tilly, she might have known, or at least guessed. That's why she had to die." Outside, the sun dipped low, casting Evervale in deep gold and shadow. The house had revealed one of its oldest secrets, but the murderer still walked its halls, and the most dangerous truths were yet to come. Chapter 9. A Forged Farewell. The morning brought a surprise. Inspector Linton summoned Jonathan to his office with a single sheet of yellowed paper laid out on the desk. "It was found in Edgar's desk drawer," he said, "folded behind a bundle of receipts. Take a look." It was brief, just 5 lines, a supposed suicide note. "I have failed this family. Evervale deserves better than me. Let the estate go where it is most needed. And each of you knows by now this was no tragic coincidence." Vivian fidgeted with her napkin. Miles stared down. Beatrice remained still, her eyes watchful. "We have uncovered a forged suicide note, hidden in Edgar's drawer. We've discovered a secret passage, unknown to most, granting access to the supposedly locked study. We've seen 2 pieces of the same letter, angry and damning, partially burned and hidden. And we now know the will was changed days before Edgar died, in Vivian's favor." Vivian stood suddenly. "Are you accusing me, Professor?" "I am saying you had motive," Jonathan replied evenly. "But you weren't the only one." He turned to Beatrice. "You feared Edgar would dismantle everything your mother built. He dismissed your devotion to Evervale. You had just as much to lose." "And what of Miles?" Vivian snapped. "He hated Edgar for years. Edgar nearly ruined him." Jonathan nodded. "Indeed. And Mrs. Weatherby. You have knowledge of family secrets, don't you? You knew what Lord Alistair was planning to reveal." The room fell silent. Then suddenly, a movement. Miles bolted up from his chair and made for the door. "Stop him!" Linton barked from the corner, emerging from the shadows with 2 constables. Miles was caught within seconds. Jonathan approached slowly. "Running doesn't prove guilt, Mr. Hollingworth, but it does confirm fear." Miles sagged in their grip, defeated. Jonathan returned to the table, laying out photographs, copies of letters, sketches of the passage. "Tonight, I will explain how it was done, and in the morning, Inspector Linton will act, but you deserve to hear the full truth before it ends." Outside, the wind picked up. Thunder growled in the hills. Inside, no one touched their food. Chapter 11. Truth in the Silence. The rain lashed against the windows as the storm broke in full. Inside the dining room, the tension was heavier still. Jonathan stood, folder open, voice calm. "Now let us speak plainly. The murderer is among us, and has been from the beginning. All eyes were on him. Edgar's death was made to appear natural, or like suicide. But the note was forged. The room was locked only to mislead, and Miss Tilly was silenced for what she may have seen. He turned to Miles. "You knew of the secret passage. You used it the night Edgar died, but you did not act alone." Gasps echoed. "Your accomplice provided the handwriting and the plan, Vivian." Vivian's eyes went wide, but it was not fear, it was fury. "You have no proof." Jonathan held up the burned fragments. "But I do. Handwriting matched to your letters, your fingerprints on the false will codicil." Inspector Linton stepped forward, nodding. "We confirmed it this morning," Jonathan continued. "The motive was clear: money, control, resentment. Edgar was going to cut Miles off. He was rewriting the will again. You both knew you had only days." He described the night. Vivian distracted Edgar, laced his brandy with a sedative. Miles used the hidden passage to enter, staged the scene, and locked the room. Later, they planted the forged note. Flashbacks painted it all in chilling silence. Jonathan finished, and when Miss Tilly recognized the sound of the panel, or saw a shadow, she had to be removed. Vivian rose, defiant. "You think this proves guilt? It proves desperation. Edgar made enemies. He drove us to the edge. We merely stepped over it." "So you confess?" asked Linton. Vivian stared coldly, then smiled. "Yes," she said, "and we almost got away with it." As the constable stepped forward, Miles wept quietly. The storm outside seemed to fade with the truth finally spoken. Silence followed, deep and long. Then Lord Alistair rose from his chair. "I see now," he said softly, "that Evervale does not fall from time. It rots from within." Jonathan bowed his head. Justice had come, at last. Chapter 12. Dusk at Evervale. The storm had passed, leaving the grounds of Evervale Hall washed clean by the rain, though no amount of weather could rinse away the shadows left inside. Police wagons came and went. Inspector Linton remained at the estate, collecting final statements and securing evidence. Vivian and Miles were taken away quietly. The family watched from the front steps as the constables escorted them through the garden path. No one said a word. Beatrice stood beside Jonathan. Her voice was barely a whisper. "We all loved him once, you know, even when he made it hard." Jonathan nodded. "Sometimes love becomes a battlefield we pretend is peace." Inside, Lord Alistair remained seated in the library, a silent portrait of grief and fatigue. He looked older than he had days before, as though a decade had passed. Jonathan took his leave shortly before sunset. As his car waited at the gate, Mr. Latham handed him a sealed envelope. It was from Lord Alistair. The note inside read, "You have done more for this house than those born within its walls. Thank you for seeing what others would not. Evervale is quiet now, but quiet does not mean peace. The past is never buried so easily. Perhaps one day you will return, if only to count the ghosts." Jonathan folded the letter, slipped it into his coat pocket, and stepped into the waiting car. As the gates closed behind him, he looked back once, at the ivy-cloaked stone, the ancient windows watching silently. Evervale Hall stood proud as ever, but he knew now, pride could hide rot, and beauty could cradle decay. He turned his gaze forward, and the road ahead welcomed him home.